So a few years ago, I found myself in a situation that tested every ounce of patience I had. I was in a meeting, one of those meetings, the kind where everyone talks over each other, where the loudest voice wins, and where somehow the person who says the least ends up making the most impact. And I remember watching this unfold, thinking, wait, is silence actually a power move? We live in a world that tells us if we're not speaking, we're falling behind. If we're not constantly asserting ourselves, we're invisible. But what if that's not true? What if silence isn't passivity, but presence? What if holding back isn't about losing power, but about gaining clarity? There's this story I love about a monk who was known for his wisdom. People would travel miles just to hear him speak. One day, a young man asked, "How do you always know the right thing to say?" The monk smiled and replied, "Because I listen. And when I listen long enough, the right words find me." I think about that a lot. How silence isn't about the absence of words, but about making space for the right ones. And that brings me to 5 truths about staying silent that have changed everything for me. Silence isn't weakness, it's restraint. I used to believe that if I didn't speak up immediately, if I didn't have the perfect response, the sharp comeback, the quick defense, I was losing. Like silence meant I was backing down, giving up ground. Because we're taught that strong people are the ones who always have something to say, that confidence is measured in volume and speed. But let me tell you about a moment that changed my mind. A while back, I was in a tough conversation. One of those moments where you can feel your heartbeat in your throat. Someone said something that hit a nerve. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the words forming so fast in my head I barely had time to catch them. And I wanted to react. I needed to react, because that's what we do, right? We defend, we correct, we make sure people know where we stand. But for some reason, instead of speaking, I stayed quiet. Not in a cold, distant way, but in a way that let me breathe, let me feel what was happening inside me. I let the silence sit there, even though it felt awkward, even though every part of me was itching to fill it. And something unexpected happened. The other person kept talking, and as they kept talking, I realized that what I thought they were saying wasn't actually what they meant. If I had jumped in with my knee-jerk reaction, I would have been arguing against something that wasn't even the real issue. My silence gave me time to understand, to hear what was beneath the words. That's when I started noticing it everywhere. The way silence can shift a conversation, the way it can open doors that forceful words slam shut. Silence isn't weakness. Weakness is reacting to every impulse, every trigger, every perceived slight. Weakness is letting our emotions hijack the conversation before we've even understood what's really happening. But restraint, that's a different story. Restraint is choosing not to fight battles that don't need fighting. Restraint is knowing that just because something demands your reaction doesn't mean it deserves it. I once heard someone say, "Never waste your words on someone who just wants to misunderstand you." And that hit deep, because how often do we exhaust ourselves trying to explain, defend, prove, when really the most powerful response isn't always more words. It's less. There's an energy shift when we stop engaging in every argument that comes our way. People expect us to be reactive. They expect us to meet them at their level, to match their volume, their defensiveness. But when we don't, when we hold steady, when we stay quiet instead of jumping into the chaos, that's when real power shows up. I'm not saying silence is always the answer. There are moments when we need to speak, when our voice is the thing that brings light into the room. But there's a difference between speaking because we have something meaningful to say and speaking just to fill space, just to make sure we're not losing. The hardest thing about restraint is that it's uncomfortable. Silence can feel like surrender, like we're letting something go unchallenged. But maybe it's not surrender, maybe it's trust. Trust that clarity will come. Trust that not everything needs an immediate reaction. Trust that some things resolve themselves without us having to push or force or fight. And when the moment does come to speak, when we finally decide our words are necessary, they land differently. Because we're not just reacting anymore, we're responding with intention, with wisdom, with impact. So maybe silence isn't about saying less. Maybe it's about making what we do say mean more. Silence lets you actually hear. We think we listen. We nod. We make eye contact. We wait for our turn to respond. But how often are we really listening? Like really listening, not just to the words, but to what's underneath them. I learned this lesson the hard way. A while ago, I was in a conversation with someone I love, and they were upset. They were pouring out their feelings, and I was right there ready to fix it. I had solutions, I had insights, I had all the right things to say. And just as I was about to jump in with my wisdom, something in their face stopped me. Their shoulders were tense, their breathing was uneven. I realized they weren't looking for advice. They weren't even looking for my words. They just needed me to hear them. So I stayed quiet, and I mean really quiet. Not the kind of silence where you're just waiting for your turn to talk. The kind of silence where you let go of your agenda, where you stop planning your next sentence and just be there. And in that space, something shifted. They kept talking. And for the first time, I heard what they weren't saying. The words were about one thing, but the emotion underneath, that was the real story. If I had spoken too soon, I would have responded to the surface level issue and missed what was really going on. That's when it hit me. So much of what we miss in life isn't because people aren't saying it. It's because we aren't quiet long enough to hear it. We live in a world that values speed, quick responses, fast decisions, instant reactions. But when we rush to respond, we skip over understanding. And the truth is, people tell us who they are, what they need, what they fear, all the time, but only if we slow down enough to notice. Silence does something interesting in a conversation. It creates space, and space invites honesty. Have you ever noticed that when someone pauses, the other person tends to fill the silence? It's like an unspoken invitation. And often what they say next is the thing that really matters. I once sat with a leader I deeply respect, and I watched him navigate a tough conversation. Instead of jumping in with his opinion, he did something that felt almost radical. He just waited. He let the other person talk, and when they stopped, he didn't rush to fill the gap. He let the silence linger just for a few extra seconds. And in that tiny pause, the other person sighed and said, "You know what? That's not even what I'm upset about." And then they told the truth. I remember sitting there thinking, wow, how many times do we miss this moment because we rush to respond too soon? Listening isn't just about hearing words. It's about paying attention to what's beneath them. The hesitation before someone speaks, the shift in their voice, the way their energy changes when they talk about certain things. And when we're too busy filling the silence, we don't catch those things. But here's the kicker. This isn't just about conversations with other people. It's about the conversations we have with ourselves too. How often do we drown out our own thoughts with noise? We fill every empty space with distractions, music, podcasts, scrolling, busy work. But when was the last time you sat in silence long enough to hear what you needed to say? Because clarity doesn't come from more noise. It comes from giving yourself enough stillness to actually listen. And maybe that's the real power of silence. It doesn't just help us hear others. It helps us hear ourselves. Because when we stop filling every gap, when we stop rushing to respond, when we actually listen, that's when we hear the things that matter most. Silence makes space for truth. A while ago, I was in a conversation where someone said something that didn't sit right with me. You know that feeling? That moment when words hit you the wrong way and you immediately want to jump in, clarify, correct, defend. I felt that urge rising in me and I was ready to respond, but something in me whispered, wait. So I did something that felt unnatural. I stayed quiet. And in that pause, something happened. The other person shifted. They sighed, looked down for a second, and then, almost like a confession, said, "That's not really what I meant." And then they told me the real thing. If I had interrupted, if I had filled that space with my own reaction, that moment wouldn't have happened. I would have been responding to the first layer, the surface level statement, not the truth underneath it. But silence gave them the space to realize their own words weren't quite right. It gave them the chance to get to what was real. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always show up in the first draft. Sometimes it needs room to emerge. We live in a world that moves fast. There's pressure to have the right response, the quick answer, the immediate opinion. But some truths don't fit inside that speed. Silence teaches patience, and patience leads to the right moment. I used to think that if I had something to say, I had to say it right now. Like if I didn't get my words out in the moment would be gone forever, and with it, my chance to be understood. So I spoke fast. I reacted fast. I pushed words into spaces before they were ready to land. And let me tell you, that approach, it led to a lot of regret, not always big, life-altering regret, but those small, nagging moments where I'd walk away from a conversation thinking, I should have waited. I should have thought that through. I should have let that breathe for a second before I jumped in. Patience is hard. We are wired for immediacy. We want resolution, clarity, understanding now. We think if we wait too long, the moment will pass, the opportunity will slip away. But here's the thing, the right moment doesn't disappear just because we didn't rush to grab it. In fact, the right moment usually shows up because we were willing to wait. I had a conversation once with a friend who was going through something big, one of those heavy life. And as they were talking, I felt that old instinct rise up in me. I wanted to respond. I wanted to fix. I wanted to say something that would make them feel better. But instead of jumping in, I waited. I let the silence stretch longer than what felt comfortable. And in that pause, something shifted. They took a deep breath and said, actually, that's not really what I'm scared of. And then they told me what was really weighing on them. If I had spoken too soon, I would have missed that moment. I would have responded to the surface level issue instead of giving them space to name what was actually underneath it. Silence isn't just about being quiet. It's about trusting that not everything needs to be forced. We don't always have to chase the right moment. Sometimes it finds us. Think about a great speaker. The ones who leave a real impact, the ones whose words stick. They don't rush. They don't cram their sentences together, desperate to fill every empty space. No, they pause. They let their words settle. They wait for the right moment to land the point. And because they wait, we listen. There's a saying I love, don't let your mouth get ahead of your mind. How often do we do exactly that? We speak before we've processed, before we've given ourselves time to understand what we really mean. And later we find ourselves thinking, I wish I had said that differently. I wish I had waited. I wish I had let that sit for a second longer. But patience in silence isn't just about conversations. It's about life. It's about learning to trust timing. We push so hard for things to happen on our schedule. We want answers now, success now, change now. But silence, the ability to sit in uncertainty, to wait when waiting is hard, that's where growth happens. The truth is, we don't always need to react immediately. We don't always need to have an answer in the moment. And when we give ourselves permission to wait, when we trust that the right moment will come, we find that the words we do choose carry more weight. Because patience isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing the right thing at the right time. And that makes all the difference. Silence is a mirror. I remember sitting in my car one afternoon, staring out the window, feeling completely overwhelmed. My mind was spinning with a million different things, conversations I'd had, things I should have said, things I wished I hadn't. And like any good problem solver, I reached for my usual distractions. Music, my phone, maybe a podcast, anything to fill the space, to keep my mind moving. But something in me paused. Instead of drowning out the noise in my head, I just sat there in the silence. And let me tell you, it was loud. That's the thing about silence. It has a way of showing you everything you've been trying to outrun. It holds up a mirror to your thoughts, your fears, your doubts, your truth. And sometimes that's uncomfortable. It's so much easier to fill our lives with sound, with conversation, with action, anything but sitting with ourselves. But here's what I've learned. The things we avoid in silence are often the things we most need to face. I once had a mentor tell me, if you can't sit alone with your thoughts for 5 minutes without reaching for a distraction, there's something in you that needs your attention. And I felt that, because how often do we avoid our own silence? How often do we convince ourselves we're just staying busy, when really we're just running? When we finally stop and let silence do its work, we start to see things clearly. We notice the patterns we've been ignoring, the truths we've been pushing aside. Maybe it's a feeling we've been numbing, a decision we've been avoiding, a part of ourselves that's been quietly trying to speak. Silence doesn't create these things, it simply reveals them. And the beautiful, terrifying thing about that is, once we see the truth, we can't unsee it. I had a friend tell me once that they avoided silence at all costs because every time things got quiet, their insecurities got louder. And I get that. Silence strips away all the distractions we use to convince ourselves we have it all together. But maybe that's the point. Maybe silence isn't here to break us down. It's here to give us the honesty we need to build ourselves back up. Because here's what also happens in silence: clarity, strength, understanding. When we stop trying to drown out our own thoughts, we give ourselves a chance to hear what we actually need, not what the world is telling us, not what fear is whispering in our ear, but what's real. I've learned that some of my most important realizations, the moments where something just clicked, didn't come when I was talking things through with someone else. They came in those quiet moments when I finally stopped trying to force the answers and just let them come. Silence asks us to listen, not just to others, but to ourselves. It's not about isolation, it's about connection. Because the better we understand what's happening inside us, the better we can show up for the people in our lives. The better we can navigate hard conversations, make the right decisions, and speak with the kind of clarity that only comes from knowing ourselves. And maybe that's the real gift of silence. It doesn't just reveal what's been hidden, it reminds us of who we really are. Silence isn't emptiness, it isn't weakness, it isn't avoidance. Silence is a teacher. It slows us down so we can see what truly matters. It keeps us from reacting to things that don't deserve our energy. It gives us the patience to wait for the right moment, the wisdom to hear what's underneath the noise, and the courage to sit with our own truth. We live in a world that tells us to keep talking, keep explaining, keep proving, but the most powerful moments in life don't always come from the words we say. They come from the pauses in between, from the space where real understanding happens, from the moments when we stop trying to control everything and just listen to others, to ourselves, to what life is trying to tell us. So the next time you feel the urge to fill the silence, to rush to respond, to force the answer, pause, let the moment breathe. Trust that sometimes what you're looking for will come, not when you chase it, but when you make space for it. And when it does, you'll know. Good luck, and thank you for listening.